Question number 7, Sue Moroney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for ACC. Was the then Minister for ACC, Honourable Judith Collins, correct when she said last year that the reason the government ignored ACC's recommendation for cuts to levies for employers and workers was, quote, because we need to get to surplus, end quote?
Honourable Nikki Kaye.
Mr Speaker, I am advised that the previous minister did not say that the government ignored ACC's recommendation. In fact, under law, the minister is required to consider the ACC recommendation. Section 331 of the Accident Compensation Act anticipates that the government may not accept the recommendation. Furthermore, Section 300 sets out the wider test that the minister must have regard to, which includes the public interest and may include a factor like the government's overall fiscal strategy.
Supplementary question, Sue Moroney.
Why did she cite Sections 330 and Section 331, Part 5 of the Act as giving her the legal authority to use ACC levies to return the Crown accounts to surplus?
Honourable Nikki Kaye.
Mr Speaker, I cited those sections for two reasons. One is under Section 330, the minister may take into regard the public interest, which may include a factor like the overall government's fiscal strategy.
Supplementary question, Jamie Lee Ross.
What information has the minister seen regarding the impact of the government's decision on the ACC board's levy rate recommendations?
Honourable Nikki Kaye.
I have seen information that shows that if the government had accepted the ACC board's recommendation since 2010, levy payers would have paid $630 million more. The Labor Party need to front up and confirm that under their policy of always accepting the board's recommendation, levy payers would be almost $630 million worse off.
Order. Supplementary question, Sue Moroney.
So, with reference to her interpretation of Section 330 of the Act, does that mean she could overcharge businesses and workers the ACC levies to fund any other promises made by her government? For example, to replace 10 bridges in the Northland electorate?
Honourable Nikki Kaye.
Mr Speaker, it's becoming very clear that the member opposite does not understand the law. I'd make 3 points. The first point is, under the law, the levies are ring-fenced, so you cannot use the money for anything but claims. The second point that we've continued to make is we take a longer-term view around the levies, which means that if you took the Labor Party approach, you would continually have levies going up and down, and we said take a more conservative approach. In the long term, that leads to stability, and that's what businesses need.
Supplementary question, Sue Moroney.
Has she sought advice from Crown law about the legal authority to overcharge ACC levies in order to get to surplus? And if so, will she table that advice?
Honourable Nikki Kaye.
Mr Speaker, look, I receive regular legal advice, but what I would say to the member is I am aware, in terms of the law, it is entirely appropriate, and it's set out under Section 330, that the public interest is taken into account, and that can include the government's overall fiscal strategy. But I would make a few other points to the member. There are a range of other factors that are taken into account, including stability of levies for businesses.
Order. Point of order, Sue Moroney.
Mr Speaker, it was a very specific question.
Order, and it's being answered at the moment. If the member would resume his order, would the minister like to complete her?
I just want to finish what I was saying. As I said, there are a range of other factors that are taken into account, including stability of levies for businesses, including future claims that may come in the future as a result of gradual process, including a range of other factors, including performance of the ACC scheme.
Point of order, Sue Moroney.
Having listened to the entire answer,
Order.
Mr.
What is
Speaker,
the point of answer?
So the point is that I specifically asked about advice from Crown law, and she didn't address the question.
If the member was concentrating on listening rather than jumping to her feet, she would have heard the answer. The question was definitely addressed in the answer. Does the member have further supplementaries?
Pay attention, sir. Pay attention.
Order.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Sue Moroney.
Is she disappointed? Well, I didn't hear the answer about Crown Law specifically, and she hasn't tabled it yet, so...
Order.
Tabled it.
Order. Very good mind to now move to the next question. I'll invite the order to rise, ask the supplementary question, make sure it's in line with standing orders. Otherwise, we are moving on. Sue Moroney.
As they all have been. Is she disappointed that the government has failed to get to surplus by growing the economy and instead has resorted to constraining economic growth by overcharging ACC levies?
Honourable Nikki Kaye.
I am not disappointed because I do actually believe we are going to make surplus this year. Secondly, I can tell you that, Mr Speaker, under our government we've given $1.5 billion of levy reductions back. We were left a $4.8 billion hole, and we absolutely are responsible for a very good ACC scheme.
Order. Order. Supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
Is overcharging New Zealanders for ACC by hundreds of millions each year the main reason that National support is collapsing in regions like Northland, or is it because of other abuses of power like that of the ACC Minister?
Order. I cannot see any responsibility for that from this particular minister. I'll invite the member. No.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Order. Point of order.
I can't see any difference in principle between this line of questioning and the line of questioning around transport that the Minister was asked earlier at question time.
Order. I invite the member, if he has a question, to ask it to the Minister for ACC in line with standing orders. If he can do that, then I can help the member get an answer to that question.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question.
Is overcharging New Zealanders for ACC by hundreds of millions of dollars each year the main reason that support for National is collapsing in regions like Northland, or is it because of...
Order. I'll hear from the Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Well, first, Mr Speaker, the question makes an accusation that's completely unsubstantiated. And secondly, it asks a minister a question that can only be answered by someone who's on the political stump, not in the House of Parliament accounting for a ministry.
I'm not sure that's true. The minister can answer in regards to the suggestion of overcharging, but she certainly doesn't have any responsibility for political parties polling in any other region in New Zealand.
Point of order by...
What is the point of order?
The point of order by Mr Brownlee interrupted my question.
Order. No. Order. I'm satisfied the question has been answered. Order! I'm being very lenient to even allowing this member to ask this question. Now, I'm inviting the member to answer the question with regards to the suggestion of overcharging, but certainly no responsibility. Order! I'm on my feet, and my patience is just about failed with this member. I have been very generous to him. It's very doubtful whether the question he's asked is in order. I'm assisting the member, and I'm not getting much gratitude shown by the member in trying to assist him. The Honourable Nikki Kaye.
He wants to watch the cricket.
Point of order, the Honourable David Parker.
I appreciate that you feel that you have been generous to me, sir. I am entitled to ask a supplementary question. My question was cut off by the Minister rising to his feet during my question.
You had moved to an area which was in danger, in fact, without doubt, had made the question inconsistent with standing orders. I could rule it out. I'm very tempted to do so. And if the member rises to his feet again, I can assure you that will be the result. Honourable Nikki Kaye.
Mr Speaker, I reject the statement in the member's question. What I would say to the member, and what we've consistently said, is we take a longer-term view in terms of the accounts, because you're dealing with a $30 billion and $30 billion potentially around liabilities. So a $300 million shift is about 1%. And what we have said is we do not want a situation like Labor left us, where you had a $4.8 billion hole, and you take into account the December shift in discount rates, which was $2 billion.
Question number 8, Peter Peroni.
Tēnā koe, Mr.
Tēnā koe.
Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Education. What